Hi, Rich Wagner again, back to talk with you about the third in our trilogy of things that are required to make a successful photograph. The first one was perfect focus, the second, proper exposure, and the third is composition. And as we've done with the others, let's define what composition means. For me, composition means three things. It means what's excluded from the picture, it means what's included in the picture, and it means how those things in the picture are arranged. There's a fourth element, lighting, but traditionally that's not been part of a composition discussion, so we'll leave that aside for now. To best illustrate some of the tips and techniques, I'm going to get back to the computer, but later on I'll show you how to make a setting on your camera that'll make composition far easier for you. Okay, let's get started, and I'm going to give you 4 tips for good composition. The first one, and I think maybe the most important, is something that's called rule of thirds. And rule of thirds essentially says don't put things in the middle of your picture. Here's a shot from one of our workshops in Paris, and it's a kissing couple and it's interesting, but they're right in the middle of the picture. Now here's the same shot with the couple in a lower thirds of the picture, and it is a more interesting, pleasing composition. The rule of thirds says that you superimpose sort of a tic-tac-toe screen over your picture. Now, you can see the faint tic-tac-toe lines, and that you want to try and put the important part of the subject on one of these thirds line. Here in the case of the lovers, here in the case of a leaf that was one of the subjects of Bonnie's photo, and over here in the case of one of the tree barks. Avoiding putting things in the middle of the photo and trying to keep some point of interest on a thirds line, whether it's a vertical one, a horizontal one, or that intersection where the verticals and horizontals meet, is a very important technique in composition. Particularly if you're going to do stock photography, because putting the model over on the thirds line here gives space for whoever buys this photo to include copy and so forth in the rest of it. If the model were in the center of the photo, there's no space left over for the purchaser to use for whatever they want the photograph to be. So rule of thirds, very important in our composition techniques. Next, let's talk about diagonal lines. And diagonal lines are more interesting to us than shooting something straight on. And particularly when a diagonal line leads to something, as you can see this diagonal, again this is from Paris a few years ago, that leads to a monument, and notice that the monument's placed near a thirds line and the diagonal kind of runs along a thirds line. Diagonal lines are very easy to use. All you have to do is step a little bit to one side or the other and turn a straight on shot into a diagonal shot. Here's another example, and again, these are strong diagonals at the Louvre and very pleasing, but we've also set our composition so that the whole building that surrounds the Louvre comprises a diagonal leading to a major point of interest. In the photos Bonnie took, we have diagonals here, and those diagonals help to draw your eye into the photo. Now we can also use this same photo illustrating diagonal lines to illustrate another technique in composition, and that is keeping it simple. Efren Padro, one of our photographers, calls it simplify. Shelley Perry, another photographer, calls it less is more. But essentially what we're doing is we are using what we choose to include in the picture to focus your attention on what we think is important in the picture. And if we just do a little cropping here and get rid of that extraneous edge over there to the left, we have a much simpler composition. You can see the before and the after. And let's go over to this photograph that we looked at, and let's use our crop tool in Lightroom to bring that little odd colored pepper, put it on a thirds line, and eliminate a lot of the surrounding material. The act of simplifying a photo is an important one. So it's not just what you include, it's also what you decide to leave out. And lastly, let's talk about framing a picture. Here's an example of framing in a photograph. The picture on the right is pretty much the same composition as the picture on the left, but the picture on the left is a more appealing photo because by using this tree in the foreground, we have basically framed the photo so that it lets people know where we're standing. It gives us a lot nicer perspective, and it can also be used to block out power lines or dull skies or other elements that you don't want in the photo. So in this case, there's one example of framing, and here's another. We have framed our subjects down here for a travel photo of Paris, not just with the Notre Dame Cathedral, but also we've framed the Notre Dame Cathedral, so that we've created a nice frame around this and put our people in context. The first is rule of thirds. Try not to put the principal point of interest in the center of the photo. Try and bring it over to a thirds line or an intersection of two thirds lines. It's a much more pleasing composition. Next is the use of diagonal lines, and they're particularly effective when the line leads to a point of interest, as it does in this photo. And those can be combined with the rule of thirds or any other compositional techniques. Third is the old keep it simple. Simplify your photos. Think more about what you want to leave out than trying to include everything that you see in front of you. And finally, try and frame your subjects. Use something in the foreground to frame something in the background, or something surrounding your subjects to give them a context in the real world. Now remember that I told you I'd give you a tip at the end on how to make your life a little bit simpler. And if you get that manual out, only going to take you a minute, and look up grid or grid display or grid lines, you'll find that there's a way for you to superimpose those tic-tac-toe crisscross lines in the viewfinder of your camera. And that helps a lot when you're trying to work with rule of thirds, or when you're just trying to make sure that you keep the horizon level in the camera. I shoot with that all the time. I never shoot without the grid lines on display in my cameras. So that's it for today. This is Rich signing off. Thanks for joining us. Have a great time taking pictures.